In this two-part video series, we're going to be learning about 4 examples of anthropogenic climate change, which are changes to the climate and ecosystems that are caused specifically by human activity. The first of which is a process that we call habitat fragmentation, and many people that learn about this don't even know that this activity can cause very serious ecological effects. For example, if we take a look at this road going through a North Canadian boreal forest, we can see that this road here actually takes a forest that used to be a single ecosystem and divides the ecosystem into multiple parts, hence the term fragmentation, to break apart into smaller structures. So one example of a human activity that can cause this is, as we see in the picture, building structures like roads, but also electrical power lines are another example of a human structure that can fragment a habitat even unintentionally. Now, one of the reasons why the organisms that are native to these habitats don't actually know that they can simply cross over here is, let's say that this caribou here wanted to get across and reunite with the rest of its population here, but a car comes down the road, hits it, and kills it. Now all of the other animals that live in this ecosystem will learn that roads are very dangerous and have the possibility of killing them, and now this process here has effectively isolated the two ecosystems into separate populations, or rather separate communities. Now, this is especially dangerous for the community on the right because each of these populations is significantly smaller than the ecosystem that exists on the left. So when populations become separated, the danger is magnified for the smaller populations. For example, we can see that this side has much fewer caribou than this side does. And if this caribou were to be killed by a car or simply hunted by a large predator population, that means that the caribou population in this ecosystem here is a lot more vulnerable to endangerment or even outright extinction if the numbers are too low to support a viable population. So even the process of building a road and separating an ecosystem can create long-lasting consequences for organism populations, especially if they are smaller. 2 much more well-known examples of anthropogenic activity that can cause disastrous effects for a climate are mining and the fossil fuel industry. In the mining industry, the digging for precious metals such as gold or silver buried deep in the earth has the unintended consequence of releasing a group of poisonous metals called heavy metals, which can eventually make their way down into the water supply and contaminate the drinking water for an entire ecosystem. 2 examples of poisonous heavy metals that are well known are lead, that used to be used in paint and gasoline, as well as mercury, a naturally occurring liquid metal that used to be used in thermometers, and eventually humans learned that both of these metals cause cancer and therefore should not be used. Now, the fossil fuel industry primarily deals with the production of organic chemicals, which are chemicals that contain carbon, including many synthetic chemicals that do not occur in nature. Unfortunately, because they don't occur in nature, many of these synthetic chemicals are difficult, if not impossible, to decompose, and these chemicals are what we call persistent organic pollutants. Persistent being a word that simply means long-lasting or everlasting. Probably the most well-known example of a persistent organic pollutant is this chemical here, more commonly known as DDT, which was originally produced as a pesticide in the 1960s and 70s, used to kill bugs in order to help farmers get higher crop yields. but unfortunately, nothing that we know of in nature can actually break down DDT, and therefore it stayed in the ecosystems permanently and indefinitely, once again ending up in the water supply. Now, DDT, once it ended up in the water supply, was eventually absorbed by the producer organisms, that being algae and small plants that live on the surface of the water. And this is dangerous because any organism that eats the algae or other plants that contain DDT will take the DDT and absorb it into their system as well. This process of accumulating, that being absorbing the poisonous chemical into living systems, is the process of bioaccumulation. Now, all living things absorb toxins almost on a daily basis, but our bodies have a way of either breaking down or getting rid of the toxins because our body knows how to deal with them, but DDT doesn't have that ability because it's not a naturally occurring substance. So that means that the DDT that was absorbed by the producers will then be absorbed into the herbivorous consumers like the fish that eat them, and eventually, because the DDT cannot be removed by the fish, it's going to be absorbed ultimately by the apex predator in that ecosystem. So because DDT cannot be decomposed, this actually threatens organisms that are higher on the food chain and will cause all of the DDT that's absorbed by plants to eventually end up at the top of the food chain, resulting in them having the most DDT accumulated. This process is what we call biomagnification, referring to the quantity of a poison reaching very, very high levels within the apex predator population. And one example of an organism that almost went extinct because of this is the peregrine falcon. So we think of apex predators as being very stable organisms because, again, they don't have any predators, which means nothing is there to keep it under control. But as a consequence of being at the top of the food chain, all of the DDT absorbed by organisms lower on the food chain is going to make it into the peregrine falcon population. Now, what did DDT actually do in order to almost cause the peregrine falcon population to go extinct? Well, even though the chemical wasn't poisonous to the adult falcons themselves because it was designed to kill insects, what it did do was weaken the eggshells of female peregrine falcons' eggs, and this caused them to break whenever the adults sat on them in order to incubate and get them to hatch, which means that no young peregrine falcons were able to be born, effectively killing an entire generation before they were able to be born. Fortunately, the peregrine falcon did not go extinct because humans banned DDT as soon as they found out the catastrophic effects that it would cause to the apex predators of ecosystems. In the next video, we're going to look at the most vulnerable examples of organisms within a food web whose threatening or endangerment can doom an entire population to danger, as well as look at what happens when humans unintentionally introduce outsider organisms and cause a disruption of an already existing food web.